I'm Jeff DeBelco, Direct the Environmental Change Security Program, and I'm fortunate to be here with Dan Smith, who's the Secretary General of International Alert. And Dan, I would love to ask you about why your organization, which is a peace building and conflict prevention organization, how it was that you came to do a report about climate change, a climate of conflict, and why did you see that as a central issue for your organization to tackle?
Well, I mean, the story of how it happened was me simply assuming that this issue was being covered somehow in the climate change debate and finding that it wasn't, and being fairly surprised by that, and then looking into it and seeing that there was a gap. There had been in the early to mid-90s, as you know, quite a significant literature about the relationship between environmental degradation and conflict. And there's some bits of that which are less satisfying than others. But the issue was a well-established one in peace research and conflict research, and that's my background. So I thought that climate change would be bound to be addressing this. As soon as we realized that it hadn't been addressed and we decided to sort of fill that gap ourselves, we saw that this was an absolutely fundamental question. I think that, you know, a lot of people who become very gripped by the global warming climate change question correctly understand and communicate its urgency and its importance, but then make the mistake of talking or acting as if it's the only thing that's going on in the world. And the important thing for us was to understand how climate change and its consequences would interact with other things that we're much more familiar with in our discourse in the peace building field, to do with lack of opportunity, social marginalization, poverty, food insecurity, livelihood insecurity, bad governance, history of conflict, to see how all of these different things would interact. So in one way, for us, climate change has just become part of the picture when we do an analysis about the conflict risk or the peace building potential in any given place where we're active or about to get active.
It strikes me that in the climate change discourse, it's in the realm of adaptation where we would potentially see responses that could take seriously that set of linkages and building some of the, lowering the vulnerability and building some of the capacities that would help ameliorate climate impacts on conflict and social stability. Are you seeing that happen?
We're seeing that discussion happen, yes. I don't think that we're seeing that process actually happen yet. Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, I think it's important that one understands how adaptation and peace building are both, or both should be, processes which are driven as much by social energy at the base, by people in their communities, and the towns where they live and so on, as they're driven also by national strategies which provide coordination and coherence. And you have to get this double reality of both top-down and bottom-up in adaptation and in peace building for them to work. And in fact, we argue that in their essence, because they're both social processes, adaptation and peace building are very, very closely related. So a society which can adapt against the threat of climate change is a society that you can imagine being able to handle its conflict and peace issues quite well and quite constructively, and vice versa. If you think of a society coming out of conflict and able to resolve some of those issues, both at the national level and at local and community levels, then that's the kind of society which can absorb the information, undertake the discussions, get the participation going that you need for really successful adaptation to climate change. So the two fit together very closely. The one thing I'd add about that, though, is that while I think it's right that adaptation is the thing you think about sort of almost naturally once you see the climate change conflict connection, you also need to think about the need for the mitigation and the low carbon strategic pathway for the economy to be also conflict sensitive, because we saw with biofuels how disastrous the impact can be of mitigation strategies if their impact on poor societies is not thought through properly.
That's terrifically helpful. We will continue to look to International Alert for bringing these communities together and participating as a peace building organization, and one very sensitive to the development questions in these climate change discussions. And I hope that we'll see more of this dialogue where I would agree we haven't seen enough yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's essential. This is not just an environmental issue, it's not just a development issue, it's not just a peace and conflict issue. If we don't understand the connectivity and the interactions between all of these different categories, we're going to get it wrong.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks a lot.